from Mr. Ralph Hennebach, who graduated from the Colorado School of Mines in 1941 and has been very generous. He died, I think it was 2 years ago now, but over the course of years he gave to the university over $1 million as an endowment that supports us being able to bring in occasional guest lecturers and visiting scholars and visiting professors. For the last year, we've had a couple of postdoctoral scholars from China, and we decided to do something a little bit different with the some of the proceeds from the endowment, and we decided to hire a person. We made an agreement with the university that the Hennebach program would pick up the path on the way to tenure, and once she earns tenure, then the university will pick it up, and maybe we can do something else again with our Hennebach proceeds. But we did a national search last year, and we were extremely fortunate and happy to have been able to get Jessica Rolston as the new assistant Hennebach professor in energy and society. So this is an effort to focus some of the interests of the research teaching in liberal arts and international studies in a way that will contribute to the larger mission of the Colorado School of Mines. So this is Jessica's inaugural lecture, public lecture, as the Assistant Hennebach Professor in Energy and Society. We are very happy to have her here. She has a PhD in Anthropology, in which she has done real live work in the mining industry. I don't know whether she's going to tell us about it, but she's actually worked in the mine, coal mining fields, as well as done research on them. So we're going to ask her to share some of her insights and ideas that will help us all understand and appreciate the mining industry from an anthropological and ethical perspective. So joining me in welcoming Jessica Rolston.
Thank you. I'm just really thrilled to be here, and I'm happy to see all of you. The grappling with extractive industries requires serious, sustained analytic attention to the interface between government agencies, communities, and corporations. And increasingly, this space is framed by discourses of corporate social responsibility, which is the main subject of my talk today. The corporate social responsibility movement, or CSR, coalesced in the 1990s around the conviction that doing good is good for business. Companies now publicly commit themselves to harmonizing their own pursuit of profit with the well-being of employees, communities, and environments. Today, it is nearly impossible to find a corporation that doesn't commit itself to responsibility, and a veritable CSR industry has emerged, complete with its own reporting genres, conferences, trade and academic journals, books and software, research centers, business school programs, consulting agencies, awards, and associations. Part of the appeal of CSR is its key terms, like accountability, transparency, dialogue, and best practice. After all, who would rightly object to corporations being more socially and environmentally responsible? CSR remains controversial because people within the academy, certain sectors, and some community groups charge that it's nothing more than an elaborate public relations sham developed by companies to preempt regulation from government agencies and watchdog groups. So unfortunately, a lot of the public and scholarly debate has kind of dissolved into this simplistic dualism. Is CSR a hollow experiment in public relations, or a hallowed solution for reconciling economics and ethics and morality with the market? Extractive industries such as mining provide particularly fertile ground from which to study CSR. Mines are not simply engineering marvels, but moral landscapes. The geographer Gavin Bridge, for example, argues that mining often figures as, quote, a metaphor for expressing anxieties about the social and environmental effects of industrialization and globalization. For example, engineers look at a photo of one of the mines in Peru where I did research and see a piece of art and how the technical, environmental, and economic systems come together to form a functioning whole. The environmental managers I met both in Peru and in the American West where I did my research often described their mines as beautiful, lending aesthetic appeal to the technical work that they did. On the other hand, environmental activists would look at the same photo and see something very different. They might see environmental degradation, the destruction of land that's the basis for traditional livelihoods, and the potential for technical systems to fail and pollute the surrounding environment. So debates about mining are equally, if not more polarized than debates about CSR. And what I will suggest in this talk and in my research in general is that debates about whether CSR is a quote-unquote real attempt by corporations to improve their practices or a vast conspiracy intended to neutralize critique misses a crucial point. And that point is that even when there are gaps between corporate discourse and practice, or between their promises and their actions, CSR does produce particular and sometimes unexpected social relationships, processes, and subjects. And analyzing this process will help us better wrestle with the policies we've inherited as well as the future ones that students and faculty here will help create. So in my research, I'm interested in the conditions under which mines, communities, and employees are able to form social contracts, even if they're not perfect. Doing this requires us to look at the cultural and historical context for projects such as the ones that I study in my work. So today I'm going to talk about 3 different areas. The first is coal development in the Powder River Basin, which is in the northeastern part of Wyoming. This is where I did the bulk of my research. The second is a large gold project in Washington State. And the third is a copper project in the Andean highlands in Peru. As Professor Mitchum mentioned, I'm an anthropologist by training. I have a deep commitment to studying extractive industries. The photo on the left is in fact a picture of me during my employment. When I was an undergraduate, instead of working at McDonald's or Walmart, I got to drive this giant haul truck around during the summers because my dad was an employee there. He's a mine mechanic. My grandfather worked in production at uranium mines, and it was after I went to college, I started taking classes in anthropology. I went back to work, and I couldn't help but look at the mines from an anthropological perspective. I was just fascinated by all of the people I was meeting, all of these new practices I was learning how to do, and kind of how people made meaning out of their worlds. And so since then, I've gone from Wyoming to other parts of the American West and down to Peru, where this is a picture of me with one of my colleagues. So what does it mean to study mining anthropologically? An anthropologist, kind of the hallmark of our practice is long-term, in-depth fieldwork. So we actually go to the place where we're going to study, and we try to talk to as many people as we can. So over the course of my research, I talked with people who worked for mining companies, both kind of in the rank and file, as well as managers, engineers. I also interviewed all of their families. I talked with conservation activists, as well as people who worked for government agencies. And the idea is to get as many perspectives as possible. And kind of when we're doing anthropological research, we're going out and talking with people. And our research looks more like conversations instead of interviews. So the idea is that we let the interesting things bubble up from the conversation instead of coming in kind of with this set list of questions or kind of our own assumptions about what's happening in a place. And a lot of times we'll find something much more interesting when we open up the space for that kind of dialogue. So there are a couple of things I'd like you to think about as I'm going through some of these case studies. And I think what I'd really like you to kind of leave here today with is appreciation for how difficult and complex it can be to define things that a lot of us take for granted, such as the public good or sustainability or even corporate social responsibility. So the first case study is the Powder River Basin in northeastern Wyoming. This is a map of some of the mines here in red. They're large surface mines that use drag lines, shovels, and trucks primarily to extract coal and engage in reclamation. They're the largest producer of coal in the United States. About 40% of all of the coal that's produced in the U.S. comes from Wyoming. Last year, they produced over 426 million tons, using just about 4,000 people, if you can imagine that kind of productivity. The reason most people unfamiliar with the industry or this part of the world think that most of our coal continues to come from Appalachia is because these mines rarely bubble up to the public consciousness because we don't have the same kind of big environmental disasters or tragedies in which there's loss of human life. That's typically when most people outside of the industry tend to hear about it. So what's interesting is that in Wyoming, the basin is held up as this kind of gold standard in how companies engage in community relations. When you talk to people around town, people have very wonderful things to say about the industry. There aren't the same kind of protests that we see in other parts of the country, other parts of the world. And this is despite the fact that back in the 1970s, it wasn't clear that the mines would actually come about. There was a lot of public misgivings about the expansion of the industry into this part of the world. But people have forgotten about it. And so a big part of my research has been trying to understand kind of what's happened in the in-between. So this is the beautiful Powder River Basin. If anybody's had a chance to drive through, it's primarily rolling sagebrush grassland, and there are about 2 months of the year where it's actually green and nice. But this is a very different context in which to mine than some of the other places with which we're familiar. So before the coal industry really expanded into the basin in the mid-1970s, late 1970s, they were coming on the heels of an oil boom that happened in the 1960s. And before the oil boom, Gillette, which is the biggest city in the basin currently, was this small little ranching outpost. The Powder Base was mostly full of people who were raising cattle and sheep, and they would come into Gillette to buy their supplies. And so the population of the town went from less than 1,000 to about 10,000 when the oil boom happened. And so the whole makeup of the town changed. So the people we have are ranchers who live on the outskirts, the energy companies who came in, the environmental organizations that the ranchers ended up aligning themselves with, as well as other community residents. So the 1970s was a time in which a lot was happening in the United States that directly impacted the way in which coal development happened in Wyoming. The first was that there was a national backdrop of the energy crisis that was spurred by the 1973 oil embargoes. And so it made opening up these mines in Wyoming this patriotic, all-American solution to an energy crisis. There was a lot of national pressure to open these mines quickly. At the same time, the 1970s was also characterized by an increase in labor and environmental activism, both in the United States in general and specifically related to the coal industry. So, for example, in 1977, there was the longest strike on record from the United Mine Workers in Appalachia. And the energy companies that ended up coming into Wyoming and proposing all of these mines viewed the basin as this experiment in trying to be more profitable by smoothing over all of their relations, by investing in community relations, and by treating their people better. So they weren't having strikes and protests. So it's kind of this living lab that they were working with. On a local level, people were really hesitant about large-scale industrial development because of what had happened in the 1960s oil boom. So when the town went from about 1,000 people to about 10,000 people, there were a lot of adjustments that had to be made. And there were some social psychologists and journalists that came to Gillette to witness this Wild West boomtown in action. They ended up coining a term called the Gillette Syndrome to talk about, they called the 5 Ds. So drunkenness, divorce, depression, drug use, and delinquency, which they viewed as just being rampant in town. And so there were outlets from New York Times, Wall Street Journal, even Playboy wrote up a huge article about the Gillette Syndrome. And this still circulates today, much to my chagrin. So in the Energy and Society class I'm teaching this semester, we read about oil development in the Niger Delta. And Michael Watts, who's this eminent geographer from UC Berkeley, name checks the Gillette Syndrome as a comparison of what's currently happening in Nigeria. So people were really hesitant about seeing another industry come in and bring in a whole bunch of more people. What happened was that the ranchers who lived around town aligned themselves with some prominent national organizations, especially the Sierra Club, to protest the mines from opening. And their biggest success was that they were able to achieve a year-long injunction against future development in the middle of the 1970s. So this is in the middle kind of all of this pressure to open the mines quickly. They win this injunction and it sparks a huge debate, both locally and in the state and in the country about what's going to happen in terms of coal. The injunction was eventually lifted and all of the mines were opened toward the end of the decade. So what happened kind of in the aftermath, on one level was there was a change in policy. So in 1977, we saw the emergence of SMACRA, the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act. This is what guides current reclamation practices in all surface mines, including those in Gillette. And the ranchers and the environmental organizations weren't totally pleased with this piece of policy. Their original goal in the injunction was to require regional environmental impact assessments rather than project ones. So their argument was that you can't really grapple with or appreciate all of the impacts of having 12 huge surface mines if you're only looking at them at a mine-by-mine basis. That wasn't instituted in this piece of policy, but it did set really tight regulations for how the mines would monitor their environmental performance. So there's this policy background. Secondly, the companies all came in espousing a discourse of corporate social responsibility. And this is 2 decades before kind of this term became a buzzword and went all over the world. They talked about themselves as being good neighbors or good corporate citizens. And to back up these appeals, they offered public mine tours so people could come on site and see how the mining process actually happened. When they started mining enough so that there was something to reclaim, they invited people to see all of the reclamation projects. They also invested heavily in community development, and then they paid all of their workers extraordinarily high wages and offered them really generous benefits to dissuade them from unionizing. And so these were kind of the pillars of this social contract that continues to exist in Wyoming. And if there's time in the question and answer period, I'd be very happy to talk about how the changes in the energy market, especially natural gas, have influenced this social contract. But I'd like to move on to our second case study, which are the Okanagan Highlands in Washington State, here also in the northeastern corner. The reason I chose kind of this part of Washington and this specific mine project is that there was an unprecedented protest against a large-scale gold mine that had been proposed for this part of the world. So a group of people, primarily, they call themselves hippies, and back to the landers were able to successfully stop an open-pit gold mine that looked like it was about to go forward. A different company came in and proposed an underground mine that they weren't able to stop, so they ended up reaching a settlement in 2008. So this specific project is often held up as kind of a best case example of how you engage communities in kind of areas of big conflict. So the social situation is different in Washington State. The 2 big groups of people who were living in this area before the gold mine was proposed and before it went in were unemployed mining families. There was a historic mining industry in this part of the world that had since had a downturn, so unemployment levels were really high and people were looking for jobs. And there were also ranchers in this part of Washington State. They tended to have smaller organizations compared to the ranches in Wyoming, and the ranchers actually ended up aligning themselves with the companies instead of against them because they viewed the mine as a way to keep their own children close because it was really difficult for them to make a living from ranching, and so they wanted a way kind of for their kids to be able to stay in the area and have jobs. The third big group of people who live there now are folks who call themselves back to the landers. So they moved to this part of Washington State in 1970s, 1980s, because they wanted to get off the grid, away from society. They viewed this as this sort of pristine getaway. And so they moved. They built straw bale houses. They have these giant gardens that they feed themselves out of. They hunt, and they try to just have their own little existence. So what happened when the mine was proposed in the early 1990s is that they viewed kind of this large-scale industrial expansion as ruining everything they had moved to this part of the country to appreciate. And so they started thinking about how they were going to deal with it. So the first thing they did was they organized themselves into a formal group, gave themselves a name, and then they started working. They made a strategic decision. They knew they couldn't win the debate just on quality of life issues. They couldn't just win the debate by saying, you know, we don't want to live next door to a mine, we want to be outside of this kind of development. What they did was they focused in on water issues. And so they hired their own technical, scientific experts, and they hired their own lawyers to go through all of the permits that were in the process of being approved. And they were successful in revoking the permit that the Water Board in Washington had originally approved for the mine, which effectively made the project dead in the water. So this was in 2000 that they were able to stop that huge, giant open pit mine that had been proposed. What happened was that that company went bankrupt, was bought by another one, and the second company proposed an underground mine. And they argued that the underground mine would have 90 to 95% less environmental impacts than the original project. And so the people in this organization found it really difficult to rally the troops because the threat didn't seem as big. They weren't actually going to see the mine kind of up on the hill, and they weren't able to count on the same sort of support that they had from kind of the network of environmental activists that they had aligned themselves with. So they ended up settling with the company in 2008. One of the lessons that the second company learned was that they had to start off talking about corporate social responsibility from the beginning. So the first company, when they would appear at hearings or when they would be interviewed for the newspaper, they primarily just talked about jobs. They talked about economic growth, and that was what they were going to do for this part of the state, and that's why people should support their project. The second company, when they came in, immediately started talking about being environmental stewards, about trying to develop the communities in a way that was harmonious with their relationship with the land. So they got the language right from the beginning, which made it more difficult to protest against them because they didn't seem kind of these evil lords kind of lurking in the background, as did the first company. The second thing they did was they set up a community advisory board. And the community advisory board included representatives from local government, as well as community organizations, and then it was open just to residents in general. And the idea was that it would be separate from the company, but the company would show up and answer questions, and they would address community concerns which were raised. And the people I talked to who participated in this project said that it was generally successful. So the mine ended up changing some of their plans to truck the ore from the mine to the mill site based on what some of the people had said. On the other hand, the main environmental activists decided not to participate in the community advisory board. They said that the mine was a foregone conclusion, that if you looked at the mission of the board, it said that it was to ensure the responsible development of the mine, that there wasn't a space to say no. And that environmental group wanted a space to say no, so they kind of kept working. What they ended up doing was having a separate settlement with the company in 2008. And as a part of that settlement, it expanded on some of the work they had originally done. So in 1994, this group was really focused on trying to get people involved in the monitoring process. So kind of they pushed through some legislation that would make it legally possible for people to enter mine sites and participate in monitoring. What they did with the settlement was make it so that they could go directly to the mine at any point that they wanted to check up on their operations and see how they were doing. They also received a large sum of money to support their own operations. So the main guy who had spearheaded the effort ended up becoming an employee of this group that turned into his full-time job. And then they were able to do a lot of their own projects, kind of fixing fences, improving creeks. So kind of the interesting thing about it is that kind of in talking to them, they have become dependent on the mine's success at this point. So it's kind of a double-edged sword for them. The main guy who spearheaded this, I think he would still love to be out kind of rallying people to oppose the mine. But at this point, because they have this partnership, if the mine screws up, it looks like he hasn't been a good watchdog. So his organization has kind of turned into this mine monitoring instead of environmental activism kind of group. And so they're struggling a little bit with their own identity. But he thinks that if there has to be a mine, he wants it to be the most responsible mine possible upstream from him. And talking to some of the company people, they said, yeah, it's awkward, you know, having to have these people just come into our operation whenever they want to. But they eventually said that it's a good thing, that it keeps us accountable, and that we're willing to do it. So this is kind of why this mine is held up as a case study in kind of quelling conflict. So the third place I'd like to talk about where I've done research is Peru. This was a big, giant, open-pit copper mine in the southern part of the country. This is what the area looks like. It's really difficult to support yourself. What most people end up doing, the indigenous folks who live there, they grow alpacas and llamas, and they also grow a lot of potatoes. And then they use those to trade with people farther down the mountain who can grow more things. What happened in this specific part of the country is that in the 1980s, the state opened up a big concession, and a state-owned mining company decided to develop it. And when they were doing so, they kicked off all of the people who were previously living there, so the campesino or kind of indigenous peasant communities, without giving them another place to live, without giving them money. They just made them leave. And so this sparked a lot of protest from the people who were living there originally. They blockaded roads, they tried lighting things on fire. It was just really acrimonious. In the 1990s, Peru decided to privatize the mining industry. So it moved over to a transnational corporation in terms of operation. And they wanted to continue expanding the mine. And instead of just kicking people off the land, they offered to buy land. And when we talked to the people living there, they said that there was a lot of pressure involved, that they didn't feel like they could say no, and so that it really kind of was a situation which they felt like they had to leave, even if they weren't legally required to do so. So the protests continued. And then in the mid-2000s, a new company came in and they instituted some of the projects that I'll talk about in a little bit in order to smooth over all of those relations. So kind of we have more than 2 decades worth of active protest. The indigenous communities were able to align themselves with national NGOs. They brought in an international NGO to bring attention to their cause. So what the second company did was 2 things primarily. And the first is that they made a framework agreement with the provincial government. So that more of the revenues that was coming from the mining operation would stay in that specific province instead of going to Lima, instead of going to the capital and the national government. They also had to negotiate with the indigenous communities because they're governed separately. And so what they ended up setting up was what they called dialogue tables. So they invited the representatives of 6 indigenous communities that were the most affected by the project to sit down at the table along with their NGOs and their kind of international partners and talk. And they outlined 4 specific areas that they were going to focus on. And the most successful and the most contentious one was the issue of land, based on the history of kind of the people's land being expropriated. So what the company did was it found land for the people who had lost it and then handed it over. The local people were generally, I don't want to use the word appreciative, but they had positive things to say about the work that the Land Commission had done, but they still had some misgivings. There were a lot of complaints that the new land was higher in altitude, so that it was more difficult to grow all of their crops, that their animals didn't do as well, that there wasn't enough water. And so it kind of wasn't ideal. When we asked the company people about this, they kind of dismissed it and they said, oh, well, these people are just nostalgic. Any land's not going to be as good as the stuff that they had before. And then you all might appreciate this. They said, we did all these studies and they had the same soil composition, it had the same access to water. So the land technically looked the same from the company perspective, but it didn't have the same kind of family histories that the people there had appreciated. The second thing that came out of these dialogue tables was small business training. So they worked with local people to kind of encourage them to create things that they could sell either at markets to kind of other people in the area or perhaps to tourists. who got lost on their way to Machu Picchu, because otherwise people don't come to this part of the world very much. So these things were all good that came out of this process, but there were a lot of limitations that are still being worked out. The first is the definition of a stakeholder. So I mentioned before that there were 6 indigenous communities invited to participate in the dialogue table. That meant that there were a lot that weren't invited, even though that they viewed themselves as being impacted by the development and the pollution in the area. So those people have continued protesting and still protest and try to make road blockades. There's also complaints of paternalistic corporate discourse, as I mentioned before, about kind of dismissing people as being nostalgic. Some of the community development officers thought that if just they could have more scientific farming, then this would just all be solved. They just need to become better farmers and everything would be okay. The third big limitation is that even though there was space for local people to participate in environmental monitoring, to look at all of the data that was coming out from the studies and the sampling, they didn't know how to interpret it because they didn't have the same kind of formal education that an engineer would and that the company representatives did. And the last that I was aware, they hadn't found a way to ally themselves or hire someone to do that kind of work for them, as we saw the people in Washington State did, who hired all of their own experts to speak the same language as the company. And kind of the last kind of big limitation that the community people identify is that the company largely sets the agenda for these dialogue tables. So the state-owned company, the first transnational corporation, and the second transnational corporation have always promised jobs as one of the inducements to get people to support the mine. And so far, hardly anyone is employed by the mine. There are a few people who work part-time in a janitorial capacity, but in general, they're not getting the same kind of full-time, well-paying jobs that they've been promised. And from the company's perspective, it's because they don't have the right kind of training or knowledge to do some of the jobs that they have available. And the community perspective is that there has to be something we can do, like invent something or teach us how to do something. So that's one of the kind of last contentious issues. And I think it's telling that kind of even though it's one of the community's main concerns, it's not one of those 4 commissions. So it's not one of the things that they can legally talk about kind of in this space. So one of the big differences in this case study is that there's a much more vulnerable population that's interacting with the company. And the second big difference is the policy context in which this is happening. So if you go back to the Wyoming and the Washington case studies, both groups of people were able to create new policy that would support their own interests. They were able to kind of use existing government channels to kind of support their own activities. In Peru, they weren't able to do this because there's very weak government structures for them kind of to access. The Ministry of Energy and Mines, up until 2008, was responsible both for encouraging investment and development in the mining industry and regulating it. And even people who worked for the government, even kind of the most pro-mining company people, said that you can't do both of those jobs well at the same time. It wasn't until 1998 that environmental impact assessments were even required for large-scale mining projects. It wasn't until 2002 that there was a formal mechanism for people like the indigenous groups to be consulted on these projects. And it was so bad that in 2005, the World Bank issued a report that concluded that the political will to resolve a perceived contradiction between promotion and regulation of the mining industry is still too weak. The MEM, because the Ministry of Energy and Mines, still has to establish itself as a credible, efficient, and neutral reviewer and approver of environmental impact assessments and licenses. So partially in response to this, in 2008, they created a new agency for environmental control and assessment within the Ministry of the Environment, which would be separate kind of from this Ministry of Energy and Mines, to make it a little bit more independent, so it could actually do some regulation. So there's 3 things that I'm hoping you can take away from the talk and from these case studies. The first is that CSR is absolutely integral to the production process. What we found while we were doing interviews and talking with people is that they tended to separate kind of this hard, real work of mining and engineering from this kind of fluffy community development, soft, sort of stuff. And what all of our case studies have shown is that you can't get to that second part unless you have a social license to operate, unless you're good at producing good community relations, in addition to being good at producing something like coal or gold or copper. And this interdependence isn't reflected in the way a lot of the companies were structured. So for example, at the Peruvian case study, they outsourced all of their community development stuff to a separate foundation that was totally separate from the mining company, even though they said that they were working together. The second thing is that CSR means different things, not only to different companies, but to different people who are engaging those companies. So in a review of CSR research, Ald et al. Distinguish between what they call old and new corporate social responsibility. And for them, old corporate social responsibility is philanthropy. So that's a company just throwing money at somebody, giving you a college scholarship, for example, if you live in Gillette, kind of where the coal mines are. A new corporate social responsibility is directly related to the core business practices. So for example, a mine is going to improve its water management instead of just sponsoring a sports team. And I think this is good and useful, but I think we need to take it a step further to think about where community empowerment and kind of what NGO people like to call capacity building fit into corporate social responsibility. One of the things that especially came out of the Peruvian case study is that there wasn't a lot of room for the communities themselves to say what kind of development they wanted or needed. And as an anthropologist, I want to kind of step back and take apart terms all of the time. But I think it's really important to think critically about what we even mean by community before we can start thinking about what community engagement is. I think a lot of times it's really, we like to assume that there's some kind of community out there that's easily definable, that all we have to do is talk to people and we will figure out what our solution will be. But when we actually get down to the complexities of the social universe, communities aren't so easily defined as distinct entities. So for example, who gets to count as a community? In Peru, we saw that there were a lot of people who were impacted by the mining industry who weren't invited to any of those dialogue tables. If you think back to the Washington case study, we had these ranchers and the hippies. They lived right next door to each other. They both kind of existed living off of the land, but they had very different interests and they had very different goals in terms of their relationship with the mine. So how would you define that community? And lastly, we have to think about who's privileged to speak for and represent communities. In Peru, one of the big complaints was that all of the indigenous leaders were men, and that the men weren't necessarily going to represent the interests of the women, or that you had all of these kind of elderly folks who weren't representing kind of the younger generations. And so these are all things that we have to think critically about when we're talking about corporate social responsibility and the role of the communities in that. I think one of the things that comes through really clearly from all of these case studies is the absolute importance of having resources so that you can access expertise, so that you can access a lawyer, so that you can draw on the knowledge of somebody who's able to interpret all of these numbers that come out about a stream and what's being found in the stream. And that when you have those resources, then you can speak the same language that the mining company is speaking. And then you can have a bigger say in how that development is happening and how that responsibility is being negotiated. If you're not able to speak that language, it's much more difficult to set the terms of that engagement. And lastly, there seems to be some sort of need or to be able to use government to your advantage, to be able to create policy or amend it in a way that's helpful to you. So just as corporate social responsibility can mean different things to different people, so can sustainability. So sustainability is the ultimate goal of all of these efforts. That's what people on the ground, in the companies talk about. And in each of these cases, what we see is a debate between what sustainability is. So we have people who could classify as being agriculturalists in some extent, whether it's the ranchers in Wyoming and Washington, or some of the small-scale herders in Peru. And when they talk about their lives, they talk about living in a sustainable way, that they're able to provide for themselves and their families up through the future. When the mining companies that they interacted with talked about sustainability, they primarily focused on the economic dimension. So they talked about having long-term economic growth. They talked about having jobs. They talked about training people to do other kind of jobs once the mine left. And that's a different version of sustainability. And I appreciate Professor Mitchum has this wonderful chapter about sustainability. And he said that it can be a bit of a plastic word because it can be molded to mean different things for many groups of people. And there's an anthropologist, Stuart Kirsch, who writes specifically about sustainability in the mining industry. And he said that it's turned into what a linguistic anthropologist would call a strategically deployable shifter. So the definition of this term only exists in a very specific context, so that it means different things depending on who's invoking it. And what he finds is this gradual shift from ecological definitions of sustainability, about being concerned about human impact on the environment, to human-centered definitions of sustainability, as this is the Brundtland Commission, meeting our own needs without compromising the needs of future generations, to almost entirely economic definitions of sustainability. And we might ask ourselves if this is an expansion of the term. Kirsch takes a little bit more critical of an approach, and he said it's an emptying out of the term. But in any sense, I think what's interesting about terms like these, whether it's sustainability or corporate social responsibility, is that it's something that gets people talking, it gets people to a table, and it's a way of negotiating what this is going to look like, so what development is going to look like. So what I'd like to leave you with, kind of the very basic take-home point, is that kind of looking at the mining industry anthropologically shows that these are not just technical problems, that they're cultural problems, and that really grappling with them requires cultural expertise and solutions as well as the technical ones. And that's why I'm just really thrilled to be here and working with you all. So I believe you're up.
We are also, thank you very much,
Do you want me to
Jessica.
read the whole thing?
We are also very pleased to have Murray Hitzman from the Geology Department do a brief comment and response. If there is anybody who is not in LAIS, any professor who is not in LAIS, who we feel very strongly that we would like to get him in LAIS, it's Murray Hitzman. He's been putting exactly these kinds of issues on the table for all of us here at CSM ever since I've known him. I actually had the occasion to team teach with him, of course, on social license to mine probably 6 years ago now. So Murray, appreciate your coming, and we welcome your comments.
So I guess I'll just stand up here and try and do a couple of things. I want to keep it brief.
Hide.
Yeah, hi. Jessica started out her talk by saying that anthropologists do field work. So I actually have a degree in anthropology too, and I wasn't able to do field work, and that's why I went into geology. So the field work in anthropology is talking to people. Field work in geology is talking to rocks. But probably might give you a bit of my sense of personality that I ended up in one, not the other, first. There were a whole bunch of things here on this talk which I thought was fantastic, which this talk actually deals exactly with what this school deals with, earth, energy, and the environment. The talk sums it up. We tend to think at this school that earth, energy, and environment is an engineering and science issue. True. But I think, as Jessica showed, the underpinnings to all that is, in fact, anthropology and culture and understanding people. So a couple of different sort of highlights I heard. One of the ways all these issues come together is a sense of place. And for many people in many cultures, that's land. But it's also a sense of scale. And one of the questions that she dealt with at the end is, what is community? Well, what is community? There's community right here in this room. There's a community of minds, which is all our different colleges and departments. There's a community in Colorado of the educational pieces with CSU, CU, DU, etc., Mesa State. And then, of course, there's the community of the state, the nation, we can go on. Which of those are important? And having worked in the industry and having to actually had to do this in several countries in the world, that's a very difficult question to answer. Because no matter how you answer it, you're always wrong. Period. And you always will be. Because you want to be as inclusive as possible, but to be totally inclusive, obviously, is economically and usually technically not possible. So what are the boundaries? How do we set those boundaries? And that's an anthropological question. That's not an engineering question. And so I guess the way I'd like to leave it is the last slide here. Not just technical, but cultural problems. Having been an anthropologist as well as part of my career, I guess what I'd say is technology is part of culture. Technology is defined by what culture you're from. Having worked in Peru, up in the highlands, they have technology. It's not a technology we learn here at Mines, but it's just as realistic a technology. So we need to think about culture actually in all aspects, right? And maybe not just the ones we normally think about. So maybe there'll be a class coming up at the school in the anthropology of engineering. Don't laugh. The best class I ever took in my entire life in school was the anthropology of law. Okay? How legal systems vary around the world. It was a mind-blowing experience to realize that lots of different cultures have lots of different ways of looking at legal systems. I would love to see a class on how different cultures have actually adapted or looked at engineering. I don't think such a class, I've ever seen one anywhere in the world, but it'd be a neat one to try and think about. So with that, I don't know what I do now, but I guess there's questions probably for her.
I think both of you stay up there and we invite questions and comments. Let's first of all thank Murray too.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, are there ways, I mean, you know, when a project doesn't go, then clearly that's a failure from the corporate side. Maybe a success from the environmental side, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. But are there indicators, gradations, nuances? The corporation can say, yes, it was worth us doing this, and not just from a, you know, go, no-go sort of dichotomy, but rather some kind of way to inference this, that they can see that it's, one, profitable, two, that it's good for the community, and there's ways that there's measures. So what do those dashboards or indicators look like from a corporate view?
Well, I think the case that might be the easiest to talk about would be in Wyoming, because those are some of the most profitable coal mines in the whole world. And that's partially because of the way that they can do the extraction, right, with these huge drag lines and shovels, and it's more productive, but it's also because they have employee buy-in, that people are caring about making those mines really productive, and they don't have the same kind of work stoppages that we see in other parts of the industry. And I tend, to me, when I talk to corporate people, it tends to boil down to economic indicators, so profitability, but I think it would be really important to think about other kind of measures, as you said, and I don't know of anybody who's done that.
Yeah, good.
So maybe a follow-up to that from your last comment about the economic indicators.
Mm-hmm.
In the Peruvian example, you said they had their MEM, like mining, energy.
Ministry of Energy and Mines.
Yeah, there.
Yeah.
And you said it was kind of come to be viewed that they can't do kind of promotion and regulation at the same time.
Right.
Well, if you have a company who is trying to adopt kind of CSR as well, I mean, don't they have maybe the same conflict, right? I mean, so at some level, is that actually possible?
This is the million-dollar question. So this is why CSR is so controversial outside the business world. So most of the people who write about CSR in Anthropology write about it in a very critical way. That it is a way that one, it's purely voluntary, right? And that people don't have the same kind of access to check up on what the companies have actually been doing, and that the most extreme conspiracy theorists take it to the level that this is kind of a way for companies to preempt regulation altogether. You know, don't worry yourselves about it. You know, we're already doing it. And I think one of the things that comes out of these studies is how important it is to still have the government in the background, at least, in order to make sure that there's a way for people to access in a democratic way the industry. So for example, there's an anthropologist who doesn't work in mining, he works with Coca-Cola, studying them. And the way that he gets access to their shareholder meetings is by buying one share of Coca-Cola every year. You know, and that's the only way that he can get into that space, because otherwise they control it. So I think that's a really important question that we're going to keep thinking about.
Let me just answer that too, and slightly from a different perspective. So when I worked for Chevron Corporation, we were trying to put a mine into operation in Ireland. And at that time, Ireland didn't have an EPA, or the equivalent. Chevron Corporation actually helped the Irish government form an EPA to regulate us. And the reason was, without rules, we didn't know how we could do a feasibility study to actually figure out if we were going to make money or not, or whether we should go forward. So it cuts sort of both ways, right? One, we really do need regulation to be able to have an economic environment where we have some certainty. So I think there's
Are you a socialist?
No, but this is
based on what's being said in the campaign, possibly, yeah.
But the same thing happened in Wyoming, actually. And so when I was doing my research, it turned out that the people who sat on all of these boards to read these permits all were employed by the industry at some place. And for people in Wyoming, that seemed very natural. I mean, who else is going to sit on a board unless you have some kind of education, and the people with the education all work for the company. But when I took this back to my dissertation advisors, they're like, oh my goodness, like the companies have taken over the state, basically. So there's kind of this practical place kind of where there's problems.
Again, well, let me jump in again with the example from Ireland. So we had the same issue, and we had an advisory board, which back then there wasn't, this was a novel concept. Would have been about the same time as Powder River. And while a lot of the people that the company wanted to put on the board were people that had the expertise, I actually convinced them to put on people from the Country Women's Association, from the local anglers group, and from Greenpeace. Okay, and the Greenpeace person actually had technical expertise. The others were a farmer's wife and a 70-year-old guy who liked to catch trout. Right, who didn't know what a mine was, didn't even know what a rock was, basically. And that was fine. That was great. Because by having lots of inclusion, we actually did get points of view very early on that we never would have gotten any other way. And so I think as companies go forward, there's going to be all sorts of companies doing this in different ways. And the ones that I think are forward-looking and actually really do want to do something well will go this way. I think governments also need to take responsibility and have regulations that probably force companies to actually do that sort of thing, right? So there's ways of making regulations that I think help what we're learning from anthropology about how to do this better.
Elizabeth?
I want to go back to a point that Marie raised about engineering culture. And so if I could start with you, Jessica, when you talk about the Wyoming case, it seems to be very successful. Mm-hmm. But then when Murray brought up his point, I thought, well, okay, so Western engineering, Western civilization, a Western
Yes.
community. They know, lawyers have got to talk to lawyers and engineers have got to talk to engineers. And so they know how to interact, and there's some basic agreement on what the main concerns are.
Right.
But then when you talk about what's going on in Peru, you have one kind of civilization, which is mostly Western engineering and concepts, and they have their lawyers and regulations and all the rest of it. And then you have a very different kind of community that they're coming into. And as you said, they don't know to have lawyers okay, so if you could just address that
Yes,
for a
so
minute.
actually, before they could even have a dialogue table, they had kind of these cultural trainings. So they trained all of the company people. This is what Andean culture is like. These are some of the basic worldviews that people here have and expectations. And they did the same thing with the communities that were living there. This is what a corporation is. This is kind of the issues that are important to them. This is the framework that they have, so that they could even start talking to each other, because there wasn't that at the beginning. And what's interesting about the Peruvian case study is that there was also a difference, not just from kind of the Western transnational corporations, but kind of the people in Lima, kind of who were coming in, were so enculturated into kind of this engineering, kind of technocratic culture, that there was also a big difference within the country, that we couldn't just kind of like say that, not Lima, why do I keep saying Lima? Think about Ecuador based on kind of our class today. But there's a distinction with the urban center and then kind of the outside too.
So let me just ask Jessica, and something that just came to my mind, that the Powder River Basin is a fantastic example in a whole bunch of ways. But what if you actually studied now the coal mining, which is also large scale, open pit, on the Navajo reservation, where some of the issues are different, right? So it's culturated, but not quite, it's not like Peru, but it still has some of these other issues. Has anyone tried to make that link, do you know?
I attempted to do this project. I was going to work at some mines in the Four Corners region.
Right.
And I had contacts with the environmental group. We were set up to do some interviews. I mentioned on the phone that I was also going to the company. They're going to give me a tour, and they stopped returning my phone calls because the situation was so polarized that they weren't willing to work with someone who was talking to everybody, basically. But I think that would be a wonderful project if you could maneuver.
Maneuver it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, over here.
Yeah, on one of your conclusions, you say that CSR needs to be implemented during the production stage. Have you done any research with companies that implement CSR at the more exploration stage? First people on the ground to sort of get the wheels turning as far as conversations with local indigenous tribes and communities, so it kind of makes the impact later on less severe?
Yes, and this is much more successful if you start from the beginning instead of having to pay for the sins of the people who've come before you, even if they were your own. Yeah.
So the role of technical expertise, you said one of the key points is that the community have access to technical expertise. Can you speak to, something I can see a lot of us in here being technical expert in said issue and being an advisor. So can you speak to how the different advisors, obviously you have one for the mining companies have theirs, and potentially NGOs have theirs, and maybe there's some provided for communities from somewhere else. But can you speak to how the experts interact on issues of uncertainty, which there inevitably will be uncertainty with different biases, and how that uncertainty is communicated to the community in those discussions?
Yeah. Did you have something to say?
I will, but go first.
No, why don't you go first? I can collect my thoughts.
Well, I was going to address a slightly different point first, and then we'll come to yours. One is, how do you get advisors for some of the participants? And usually it's the local communities that don't have as much access. And I don't think we figured out how to do that. Typically, the company will actually put up money so that the local community can hire somebody. That's because the community doesn't have the economic wherewithal to do it. That's probably not ideal, but in an early situation, I'm not sure how else you deal with it, unless you have some sort of fund in a governmental sense that can do it. But another area I worked in my career was up in northern Alaska with the Red Dog Mine and with some of the native corporations, there. And what they did is they didn't have the expertise when they started, but natural resources have become an important part of several of the native corporations in the state. And the corporations have invested heavily in actually training their own members, a cadre, at places like Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, in law, engineering, and science. So that now, 20 years on, those native corporations are as sharp as any company in the world. So they actually went out, that community went out as, very systematically to gain the expertise. And I think that's a really neat example of, in places like Peru, where we expect that resource extraction will be important for many generations to come, how can Peru actually help some of its native communities to gain expertise among their own people? Again, we don't know how to do that, but that's where I think we need to be thinking about, and that's an anthropological problem.
Yeah, it's the interim that's really challenging, right? When you don't have the local people who have the right training. What the people in Washington State did was that they just hired a consulting agency that was an independent third party that they could just have on a contract basis, like you would have a lawyer kind of at your disposal. Then they could kind of use this consulting agency when they needed it. The company also put up money, kind of as Marie was saying, to hire independent contractors, independent consultants to look at some of these things. And the problem is that when it comes from company money, then the local people are very suspicious of it. And so it's difficult figuring out where you're going to get the money to fund all of this stuff, because money has its own kind of obligations and ties. So the way that they were able in Washington to hire their own people was through raising money through these other networks of activists and bringing attention to their causes.
Yes, right here.
You talked about the two cases here in the U.S. and they don't quite parallel with the one in Peru. And you mentioned also the situation in the Delta region of Nigeria.
Yes.
What I'm wondering is, the extracting companies, the ExxonMobil and others who are going into these countries, do you see that they're actually learning how to work better with the local communities? Because they're coming in at the government level and they're crafting their contracts and getting their admission into the countries through the federal government. And so they're really not beholden to the local communities necessarily. Right. They go in to do extraction or even whatever kind of planning they come up with, it's all vetted at the government level, not at the community level. How is that happening? Is it changing from your experience? I mean, it's a question for both of you because you've observed this for several years. Is it changing at all? Or is it staying at that federal level and not really, they don't really necessarily care about the communities?
Yeah, I think this is one of the problems of scale that you were talking about earlier as well. And the problem with what's happening kind of in the Nigeria is that even if they try to identify a community that they can work with, someone else identifies themselves as a community so they can access those funds, and then someone else identifies themselves as a community. And so I think the challenging thing is that I see in the cases where I've worked, there's this division of labor between what the company does with the federal government, and then kind of there's all of this voluntary stuff on the local level, that it's not as beholden and framed kind of by the regulations as much. You have more experience than I do.
I agree with everything she said, but let's just take Nigeria. I haven't worked in Nigeria, but I know the example somewhat. In most countries, Nigeria included, the rights to the resource, in this case oil, belong to the federal government, not to the local community. That's by law in Nigeria. So that's an inherent problem, right? Because Shell, who's the main producer there, they want access to that resource, which means they're doing it through the federal government. Now, they also know clearly they have to be on the ground and use surface rights, which is the local community. But this is sort of where the anthropology of law comes in, right? How legally do these things work in different cultures and different societies? Right now, in most of the world, resources are held by sort of a larger government entity rather than by the local government entity. So there's already a tension. In Peru, one of the things Jessica talked about in her example was one of the ways to try and alleviate problems were to get more of the rents or the royalties, the taxes, to not go to Lima, but to go to the local area. That's a big deal. But in Peru, that's taken 15 years now, and there's still a lot of tension, not so much among the companies. The companies would all love to see the taxes all go to the local place and not Lima. You know, they all would love that, but that's not legal. So how do you change Peru's laws?
Right.
As an American, I can't help influence their laws.
And you would be looked badly if you did try to go influence their law.
Exactly. So again, this gets back to culture very firmly.
When this
Let me
happens in the
do
US
a little pause here, because Murray set us up for a little advertisement that I want to make before we lose Juan Lucena. He said he'd love to see a course in the anthropology of engineering. Well, Juan actually teaches something pretty close to that, engineering cultures. He's an ethnographer of engineering. So would you just say just two or three words about your course to call it to the attention of people?
Okay, so let the record show that I was on my way out to pick up my kids, and he brought me in for the sales pitch. So okay, here it is. So the course, the engineering cultures class, and actually there's one here called Engineering Cultures in the Developing World, actually looks at three key questions. What is an engineer? What constitutes engineering knowledge? And how are engineers expected to work in a particular society? And we look at a number of countries, mainly in Latin America and Africa, where Colorado School of Mines has either projects or affiliations to companies on those. And through the answers to those three different questions, we look at the similarities and differences of engineering cultures in different countries. But I was also interested in Sean's question because the question of expertise and where the expertise resides, and in listening to the answers, I realized that the companies are trying to sometimes provide expertise to the communities, expertise that they don't have. The communities are trying to find different ways to seek expertise that they don't have. The corporations often don't have expertise about community development. And one of the things that I argue, and that I would like us to do more here, is actually give the expertise to the engineers about sustainable community development. So instead of expecting that the expertise is going to reside in some corporate boardroom or in some community organization, and there are places there for expertise to reside, how about also in the engineers themselves? How can we educate engineers to be able to navigate a complex landscape like the ones Jessica presented here, to understand both what are the goals of the corporations and what are the goals of the community? And can I, as a technical expert, navigate those different and sometimes conflictive interests?
Okay, and Juan is the director of our humanitarian engineering program with the support of Kevin Moore and Elizabeth Davis. So this is another avenue for, I'm sorry, I'm excited by what you're doing, so I can't help but try to promote it.
All right.
Okay.
So now I gotta go get my kids. Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
I had a question. You talked about how the corporate discourse tends to be paternalistic in the situation of specifically of the most marginalized groups. And it seems to me the most marginalized groups, that's where there's the most responsibility on the corporation because there's such a disparity between the power of these two groups. So are there other kinds of discourse models? It seems to me very natural that you would use a paternalistic discourse because you don't know anything and I know everything, right? I mean, that's how we sort of think of it. The corporation has all the technical expertise.
Right.
These people have localized knowledge, which there's some lip service given to the importance of local knowledge and all that kind of stuff. But what other kind of models or how would you recommend to do that differently?
I think, well, see, this is kind of where the community empowerment stuff comes in and the capacity building, right? So that one of the larger critiques about corporate social responsibility is that everybody talks about partnerships, but those partnerships aren't equal because they don't have access to the same kind of resources. And I think it's insulting to call something like this a partnership. And so where I would look is the literature on kind of community empowerment and community development.
So just as a quick follow-up
Yeah.
question, I mean, to me, even that seems like it's still a kind of, we are going to empower the community. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, that to me seems like there's this fundamental question of, we are going to teach you how to be empowered.
Well, I would look at what's called participatory action research. So participatory action research is kind of when you go in and you work with the community to help kind of them identify their own needs. Not you saying these are what your needs are, but I know that I have this round table model that maybe I get everybody here and we can start talking. And the idea is to help them identify what knowledge they already have and what needs they're already able to express, but in a more formal way that can be understood by outside groups. Those are great questions, though.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions here. Yes, Jason.
So I wonder, following up on that question, if you see a pattern of sort of a mining interest coming in and sizing up the power of the community, either in terms of regulatory environment or organizing potential or sense of community or what have you, and that the sort of CSR response is proportional to that estimate ahead of time. And so, I mean, it's a bit of a cynical view, but you might say, for example, when the state came in and just took land away from all of the peasants in Peru, that's an example where, the sense was we have so much power, there's so little that these peasants can do, CSR doesn't need to play a role. And yet if you look in the US context where you have organized labor, at least the threat of it, you have some environmental regulations, there's a sense that you have to do some CSR, otherwise you're going to fail.
Yes, and this is one of the arguments made from the academy is that CSR only emerges kind of when you have this counterbalance coming from this way. And so kind of this is the critique of it being a voluntary effort, right? That it's not voluntary, that it's something that they're doing to address a criticism of their practices.
I'd go further. I don't think it's cynical. I think it's realistic, period. There are parts of the world where I know mining companies won't go because the communities are just dead set against mining and it's not worth it, period. Right? I think it comes down to culture again. And it comes down with your question to one word, respect. You have to respect the people you're going to be working with, and you have to somehow see if they can respect you back. Okay? Because to do this, if I'm a company, when I was in the company, why would I spend my money in a place where I think I'm not going to be able to do a development? It's wasted money. Why should I even go there? Right? There's parts of Peru right now that I would not spend a penny in because I think the chances of developing a project are zero. So why would I do it? There's other parts of the world where I think it's probably much easier from a CSR point of view, but it basically means the culture of the community there is much more receptive. That would make me more attractive to go there. I don't think that's cynical as much as pragmatic. Maybe I'm being wrong, but.
Okay, let's get a final question, comment right here.
Yeah, I was actually up in northern Peru last summer. I was doing very similar studies, and I was looking at just both the economics from the business standpoint of CSR and the sustainable development of CSR, and kind of the balance between the two, where you find that middle ground, and does it matter really what the intentions are if it's the outcome? And I think a really interesting case study to look at that I was just kind of getting into was the Congo project. And it's fascinating because what the Yanakosha Consortium has done is very unique and it's very much community empowerment. But at this point, it's local government and environmental activists that are coming in instead. So, it's almost like CSR was starting to like formulate in this area, and because it's Peru, and I'm sure there's a whole slew of historical context that goes into that. I'm just wondering, like, will CSR begin to spill over into the other big actors, which are government and other organizations that really kind of like halt this kind of big progress?
Yeah, and I don't mean to be a pessimist, but people are killing each other over this project.
But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think CSR for a company who's doing it right, it's not just the local community anymore at all. That's what I meant by scale. If you're really thinking about this, it has to be the local community, the provincial area, let's use Peru, the federal government, the NGOs as a community, which you're going to have to deal with, period. Right? So you need to think about that and bring them into the project early on. And assume that they're going to hate you and not want it. But you have no choice, so you might as well do it early on. Right?
Is there anybody developing any kind of global standards?
There are all sorts of global standards, but they're all voluntary, right? And so it ends up being kind of the shiny thing that you can put on your year-end report, that we met this kind of international convention. And there's no enforcement behind it. So the companies that aren't doing a good job aren't going to do it.
Okay, I think we ought to stop here. I'm sure they will be willing to take a few more questions after if somebody wants to come up. But I think you can see why LAIS is very pleased that we were able to get our first choice in the search that we did as our new assistant Hennebach professor in energy and society. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for coming.